Hello, this is Professor James Strickler. This is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 7 about the judicial branch. It's Lesson 15, the final lesson of Unit 7, about judicial restraint. In this lesson, you'll learn about judicial restraint, you'll learn about originalism, you'll learn about textualism, you'll learn about strict construction, and you'll learn about loose construction. We've been asking in the previous lesson, can the Supreme Court's power, its judicial activism, somehow be checked? In the previous lesson, we talked about 4 possibilities. About if they misinterpret a law, simply passing a new law that tells them to do it the correct way, and we realized that wouldn't really work because they just then misinterpret the new law also. Or how about we pass a constitutional amendment ordering them to read the laws in a certain way, but then they just interpret the constitutional amendment the way they wanted to continue doing what they wanted. Or how about non-enforcement? We just simply don't enforce their decisions. We systematically disobey what they said because we think it's wrong. Well, that probably wouldn't work in modern America either because they've developed such a reputation, such a following, such a belief generally among the American people, almost a religious devotion to them, that anyone that disobeyed the Supreme Court would be viewed as the lawless person. And then finally, we looked at the possibility of transformative appointments, of appointing someone new to the court that wouldn't exercise this power. And we saw that that's problematic for several reasons also. Most importantly, that the person being appointed would probably be borked because there's people out there that would want the law to continue to be misinterpreted for their benefit. So, can the Supreme Court check its own power instead? Well, maybe. But another way to think about that is, can the Supreme Court choose not to be judicial activists? Okay, well, maybe they can, but what do we really mean by that? Checking their own power, not being judicial activists, what are we saying? Well, to understand what that means, we have to remind ourselves what judicial activism is. Judicial activism we described previously as legislating from the bench. So, if the Supreme Court's going to check its own power, if it's going to, despite having all this power, choose not to abuse it, one of the ways they're going to have to do that is by choosing not to make up laws, not to rewrite the Constitution, so to speak. They would also have to choose not to engage in results-oriented decision-making. That's the other characteristic of judicial activism we talked about before. What that means is, if a court's being judicially active, when they get a case, they look at it and they say, who do we want the winner to be? And then they kind of backtrack from there and figure out some way to fit it in the law somewhere to make the right outcome result that they want. That's judicial activism. Now, if they're not going to do that anymore, what are they going to do instead? They're going to practice what we call judicial restraint. It's the opposite of judicial activism. And the opposite, what this means is they will not be legislating from the bench. They'll be declining the opportunity to make up their own laws and instead enforce the existing laws that are given to them. How will they do that? They'll do that through process-oriented decision-making. Now, notice how different this is from judicial activism, which is results-oriented decision-making. In process-oriented decision-making, rather than figuring out who you want to win or lose and then working back and finding a way to get there, instead, you just implement the process that's been created. You dump the facts in the machine, turn the crank, so to speak, and whatever decision pops out, whether you like it or not. You simply apply the rules in the way that you are supposed to apply them, and whatever result that gives you, that's the result it gives. You aren't trying to figure out what result you want beforehand. You're just trying to fairly enforce the process as it was designed. That's what judicial restraint is. So, are there judges out there, particularly on the Supreme Court, who actually practice judicial restraint? who actually are process-oriented rather than results-oriented, who actually are trying to not make up their own laws but simply enforce the laws that are given to them? Well, one example of this sort of judge would have been Robert Bork had he been put on the Supreme Court. That's why he was nominated by President Ronald Reagan, who wanted these kind of judges on the court to restrain the court's power. He said that Bork was the most intelligent and powerful advocate of judicial restraint. That's why he picked him. But we saw what happened to Bork as people opposed his nomination. So, what would we have a judge do if the judge were actually practicing judicial restraint? In other words, what should we be looking for out there to see if a judge really is a restrained judge or not? Well, one thing the judge might be doing is something called originalism. Originalism is a particular way of going about figuring out what a text means. So, someone hands you a law and you're supposed to figure out what it means. An activist will look at the law and say, well, what do I want it to mean? Well, I'll decide what I want it, then I'll figure out some way to explain that's how it actually meant. That's the results-oriented decision-making. But for an originalist who's trying to be process-oriented, they have a process they go through. And whatever result it gives, it gives. So an originalist would look at that law, that text that is handed to them, and they'd say, okay, whoever enacted this law, in the case here, this quote, Robert Bork is talking about the United States Constitution, so he's referring to the ratifiers of the Constitution. But the point is still the same. Whoever enacted that law understood this law to be doing something when they enacted it. And that something is whatever the public understood those words to mean at the time that that law was written. So if the law was written in 1787, then if you were trying to do the kind of work that Robert Bork is doing here, originalism, you would go back historically to 1787 and say, these words on this page, what did they mean to people back then? Whatever they meant to people back then, when this law was written, is then what it means, whether I like it or not. That's how you go about being an originalist. So, an originalist finds the meaning of the text not in his own desires as the reader of the text. Instead, he finds the meaning of the text in the general understanding of those words when they were written. What did people think they meant at the time that they were written down? That's what an originalist does. Now notice, the originalist is looking for meaning outside of himself when he does this. Okay, a second way that a person can practice judicial restraint is to be what is called a textualist. Now this is very similar to originalism. You're going to realize that. In some ways, there really isn't much difference, although the people that do these things may argue about whether they're an originalist or a textualist for little detailed nuances between them that only judges and law professors and that worry about. Nonetheless, I'll present this to you. There's judges who also call themselves textualists, who are trying to practice judicial restraint. An example is Antonin Scalia. He was a member of the United States Supreme Court until he recently died. At the time that I'm making this recording, there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court from the spot that he had that hasn't been filled yet. Antonin Scalia believed in textualism, which here he talks about as the text being the law, and it's the text that we'd have to follow. And thinking that way makes a person a textualist. What he means by this is you don't really care what people meant to say. You don't care what their intent was. What you care is what words were actually put on the page. So a textualist doesn't look for the meaning again in their own desires. Instead, they look for meaning in the plain definitions of the words as they were written. Originalism and textualism are both sometimes called strict construction. In other words, as the originalist or textualist is trying to find the meaning of a particular text, a passage, they are very strictly constructing that meaning based on the original understanding, the clear definitions of the words, things like that. So people who do this kind of thing The practitioners of originalism and textualism are referred as strict constructionists. That's what they're doing as they're figuring out the meaning of these things. This then is opposed to people who are called loose constructionists, who reject originalism and textualism. Now, why would they reject those things? They would reject those things because they want to have more flexibility in what they do. They don't want to be anchored down by the original understanding of the text that they're reading. They don't want to be anchored down by what these words mean in the dictionary. They want to have things loose so they can twist them around and bend them to mean the thing that they want them to mean. This is judicial activism. So, people who believe in judicial activism can be called loose constructionists. They're trying to use their power of interpretation to allow them to get the meaning they want to accomplish the thing that they want. So a way to sum up these point of views is an originalist will go look at historical text to figure out the meaning of something. You hand them the Constitution, they'll go look at the Federalist Papers, for example, and say, okay, as people were arguing about this constitutional passage back then, they understood this constitutional passage to mean something. Well, what they understood it to mean is what I'm going to say it means now. A textualist would go pick up a dictionary from the time and say, okay, this was written in 1787. Here's this word on the page. I'm going to look up in a 1787 dictionary and see what that word meant then. Then I know what this word was put in the Constitution to do. But a judicial activist doesn't really care what people meant to do when they put it in the Constitution. They don't really care what the words actually say. Instead, they look at their own hearts and say, what should this say? What's going to be the morally right thing from my point of view to read into these words to get the right outcome? That's so they aren't going to look at a history book, they aren't going to look at a dictionary, they're going to look at their own heart to find the meaning of the words. All right, well, do any Supreme Court justices currently choose not to be judicial activists? Well, remember, originalism and textualism are things that are about judicial restraint. They're about reducing the power that the judicial branch is going to have. And most judges aren't going to like that. They aren't going to like practicing techniques that reduce their power. And it's also not going to be liked by the people out there in the political parties, the interest groups, whatever it is, who want to see judicial activism to help them accomplish their policy goals that they can't otherwise get. So there's going to be a lot of people out there that don't like originalism and textualism. There's going to be a lot of pressure on judges to not be originalists and not be textualists. So if we look at the current composition of the United States Supreme Court at the time of this recording, we've got 8 justices on the court and 1 vacancy. And of those 8 justices, 5 of them clearly are loose constructionists, clearly are judicial activists. Clearly they're deciding what the things mean that are brought in front of them based on their own personal feelings of what those passages should say, to do what is the good and right and just thing in their minds. Then we've got a couple of justices who are in purple here because they're kind of in between. Sometimes they act like originalists and textualists, and sometimes they don't. Which may say, maybe they're just being originalists and textualists when it happens to agree with their biases already. And then you've got one justice on the Supreme Court, the lone justice, who stands up and says, I am an originalist. I am a textualist. No apologies. That's what I am, and that's what I'm going to stick with. And that is Justice Clarence Thomas. Now, there are so few justices on the Supreme Court that practice judicial restraint as originalists or textualists, because even when people get on the court with those attitudes, they seem to grow away from them. And part of the reason is because they get immense social pressure to change. They're constantly influenced by academics, like law professors and people straight out of law school who clerk for them, who are putting pressure on them to become activists. They're constantly being pressured by the news media, which seems to like activist judges better than restrained judges. And for all these reasons, these people tend to side with those groups and evolve into activists. So it takes a very strong-willed man, like Clarence Thomas, Here's a picture of him, the lone conservative originalist textualist. Now, when I say conservative, I'm talking about in a judicial sense, restrained, not necessarily a political sense, but the lone originalist textualist on the Supreme Court who has remained that way because when he got on the court, he slammed a slide down on his desk that said, "I ain't evolving," which is a direct reference to the kind of thing talked about in the quote preceding this slide. He realized that many judges get on the Supreme Court and start changing their minds about things. They come in believing in judicial restraint, and then they get the immense power that judges have on the Supreme Court, and they're just so tempted to use it to do what they want in their heart to do that they end up giving up on process-oriented decision-making. They switch over to results-oriented decision-making. So the only way he could remain true to that, true to being a restrained judge, was to slam down his fist and say, "I will not evolve," and have that as his mantra on the court. And so he is the lone, clearly restrained judge on the court, which shows you just how difficult it is to actually contain the power of the court. Because all the outside ways to check their power are ineffective, and if the court chooses within itself not to contain its power, then it can pretty much get away with whatever it wants. As long as it continues to nurture its reputation and trust with people, as we talked about previously, it remains the predominant force in society. To use a sports analogy to end this, the most powerful person on a football field is the referee, particularly if the referee can make up the rules as he goes along. And that's the position that the Supreme Court is in. Okay, now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What is judicial restraint? Is it a judge being barred from a case? Is it process-oriented decision-making? Is it the guilty party being imprisoned? Or is it the refusal to hear a case? Judicial restraint is process-oriented decision-making. Where do originalists look for meaning? Do they look for it in the general understanding at the time that the law was written? Do they look for it in the dictionary definition at the time a law was written? Do they look at it into the needs of our modern society? Or do they look at their own personal sense of morality? An originalist looks to the general understanding of the words in a text at the time that it was written. Where do textualists look for meaning in a text that they're examining? Do they look for it in the general understanding at the time it was written? Do they look for it in dictionary definitions at the time it was written? Do they look for it in the needs of our modern society or in their personal sense of morality? The textualist looks for the meaning of something in the dictionary definition of the words used in it. What is a strict constructionist? Is that an originalist or a textualist? Is it a judicial activist? Is it a careful opinion writer? Or is it a judge relying on evidence? A strict constructionist is an originalist or a textualist. What is a loose constructionist? Is that an originalist or textualist? Is that a judicial activist? Is that a careful opinion writer? Or is that a judge relying on evidence? A loose constructionist is a judicial activist. They are trained to loosely read the text to enable them to twist it around to have whatever meaning they want, to then actively pursue the outcome that they prefer. That completes this lesson, and that completes Unit 7 about the judiciary. The next lesson will be from Unit 8. It'll be Lesson 1 about rights.